Okay, so for those of you that aren't in the lesson, I've only just hit record. I've just mentioned about the League's covenant, mitigation, moral condemnation, economic sanctions. I would argue that the League wasn't given enough power at the very beginning to do its job properly. It was always going to find it difficult to deal with aggression, only using those punishments there. Mentioning that the Assembly only met once a year and the vote had to be unanimous, and there were 42 members of the Assembly to begin with, and getting them to all vote the same way is very difficult. Also, only meeting once a year isn't going to enable the League to be effective in doing its job. As a result of that, the Council was set up to meet more frequently, but Britain, France, Italy, and Japan were permanent members of the Council that could always veto anything the Assembly decided. That was unfair. We had the Court of Justice with 11 judges, but its rulings were never compulsory and it was only advisory. And that's never good because plenty of countries like Japan and Italy could just ignore what the court said. The Secretariat basically does anything that you guys decide upon. If they decide upon a course of action, the Secretariat puts it into practice. And then you've got the special commissions down here, because it's worth noting that the League of Nations job wasn't just to stop wars, it was to create a better world. It was part of Wilson's 14 points for a better world. Okay, we looked at the successes and failures of the League in the 1920s. So Vilna, failure; Upper Silesia, success; Åland Islands, success; Corfu, if you're doing it, but we glossed over it, it was a failure; Bulgaria was a success; and the Wall Street crash was a failure. So the League had a mixed bag of successes and failures throughout the 1920s. You could argue that some of these events here also made it hard for the League to do its job in the future. People started to lose faith in the League. These two agreements also made it difficult for the League to stop aggression because it made people fall out of favour with the League. They lost trust in the League because the Locarno Treaty and the Calabrian Pact are brilliant for the world, but it was done behind the League's back. So anybody that disliked the League could simply say, hey, look, we don't need the League. We can solve the world's problems by ourselves without the League sticking its nose into other people's business. The Wall Street crash made it difficult for the League to deal with aggression. There was a decline in international cooperation. I do like that title because countries are now focused on their own economic problems rather than trying to worry about other countries. And on top of that, it meant the League was less likely to impose economic sanctions because it doesn't make sense to punish one country economically whilst punishing yourself. And that brings us up to these two major events that happened in the 1930s. And these two events spelt the end for the League. It was the final nail in the coffin for the League of Nations because the League wasn't able to deal with aggression shown by Japan and Italy. They were utterly useless. They were shown to be a complete failure. And as a result, people lost faith in the League's ability to do its job. And the League eventually collapsed after the Abyssinian crisis. And that was terrible for the world because the League actually is a really good thing. Okay? It could have potentially combated the rise of Hitler. Now the League was gone, the world's going to be a more dangerous place. So, what we're going to do today, we're going to go over the Manchurian crisis, 3 points. We're going to have a look at why Japan wanted it, what prompted the invasion, and then the League of Nations. And we'll do the same for Abyssinia. We'll look at why Italy wanted it. We'll have a quick look at the invasion, and then we'll have a look at the role of the League of Nations and what the League did or didn't do in this case. So let me zoom in. Now, I'm not sure whether you want to take notes on this or not whilst we talk. I am going to highlight key points. It's being recorded, so you can refer back to this session on YouTube at any point. You can get your notes out or have your flashcards, and you can work through them at your own pace. Okay, I do quite like the fact that they've been recorded because during these sessions, I push you towards the important bits. And you have lots of these important bits in your book, but if you try to revise from the textbook, you would struggle. There's too much information here, and what we're going to do now is pick it apart into the important bits. So, I can't see the comment bar. Nobody's written a comment in the chat bar. So, if you have got something to say, it might be worth unmuting yourselves and just interrupting me. I don't mind at all. but it might be, well, it will be very easy for me to miss something that gets written in the chat bar. Okay, so Manchuria, hopefully you know where Manchuria is by now, and you are screaming at your screen that it was in China. It's well worth knowing that it was in China. Right? You need to know why Japan wanted Manchuria. And I'm going to go back to the chat bar now. Somebody write it in. What was one of the main reasons why Japan wanted Manchuria? What was it going to give Japan? It's going to boost what? Industry. I'll take that, Don. I'll say the economy, absolutely. The Japanese economy was in a miserable state, brought on by the Wall Street crash in 1929. So throughout the early 1930s, Japan was suffering massively, especially silk. So what have we got here? Suffering from the Great Depression, and much of the Japanese economy was based on exporting silk to rich countries like the USA. Does the USA want any silk during this period in the early 1930s? Absolutely not. So the silk production in Japan plummeted. Unemployment skyrocketed, and by 1932, silk was worth 1/5 of what it had been sold for throughout the 1920s. So the Japanese economy was in meltdown. Its main industry had taken a massive battering. And on top of that, Japan is a small chain of islands with very few natural resources or farmland. Okay? Manchuria, on the other hand, has lots of this. So Japan saw Manchuria, the invasion of Manchuria, as a way of solving its economic problems. And you do need to be able to tell this story. So, down here you see a few bullet points that explain why Japan wanted Manchuria, as well as for economic reasons. We've already mentioned industries. Okay? Japan had lots of industries in Manchuria already. Okay? They thought this would be a foothold for the invasion. On top of that, China was scared, or rather Japan was scared, that China might kick out these industries. Japan can't afford to lose any of its remaining industries. That would be catastrophic for Japan. And you could even argue, this one in the middle, right, that there was confusion over the ownership of Manchuria. China had only been the recent owners of it. Russia had owned it in the past, and so had Japan. So these bullet points, along with the economic reasons we mentioned just previously, prompted Japan to invade Manchuria. So, go over here. The Mukden incident prompted the invasion. Now, you don't need to know too much about this, okay? It's worth revising, but I wouldn't spend too much focus on the Mukden incident by itself. But hopefully you already remember that the Japanese claimed they were attacked by the Chinese on the South Manchurian Railroad. The Chinese denied it. They said they were sleeping at the time. But Japan was looking for an excuse to invade Manchuria, and whether this happened or not, Japan used it as an excuse. And number 3 down there, the Kwantung Army invaded without the support of the government. But the people of Japan were so overwhelmingly happy about this invasion, they saw it as a show of force, something to be proud of within their country, that the government had no choice but to go along with it. And in place of the old Manchurian leader, they put Pu Yi. He was the ex-Chinese emperor, but he was a puppet ruler for the Japanese. He was going to do the Japanese's bidding. He was Chinese. That was a good choice by the Japanese, because the people of Manchuria are more likely to obey Pu Yi because he is of their nationality, a Chinese, rather than being Japanese. So that's the Mukden incident. Like I said, I would revise it, but I wouldn't spend too long trying to memorize it. Moving on. This is probably a bit more of an important area to focus on rather than the Mukden incident, and it's a reaction by the League of Nations. This whole topic is about the League, so I'd definitely be paying some attention to how the League reacted to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So let me zoom in a little bit on this, because again, it's very blurry on my screen, so I imagine it's pretty blurry on yours. So, why was the League reluctant to act? Let me take this back. Let me turn this over to the chat bar just really briefly. Does anybody remember off the top of their heads why the League was so reluctant to act when Japan invaded Manchuria? Any ideas at all? The Great Depression, absolutely. The League was very, very far away from Japan. Its headquarters were in Switzerland, and its countries were suffering heavily from economic depression, which meant there was less enthusiasm to go and get involved in this conflict. They didn't want a big fight, absolutely. They were still very aware of World War I and were trying to avoid it. They didn't have an army, so they were not prepared for a big fight. Japan was one of the League, yeah, absolutely. It was one of the League of Nations key members, one of the permanent members of the council, as you said there, Alondra. And as a result, when they said they were attacked, people believed them, okay, because Japan was an ally to everybody. And they said they were attacked first. So initially, people believed them. Well done. You've got some really good ones there. And you've covered many of the ones that I'm going to highlight from this bit. So why was the League reluctant to act? I would be doing a flashcard on this if I were you. I'd have that as a title, and I'd have some of the reasons that you can see in front of you. You don't need all of them, okay? You're not a robot. We don't expect you to remember everything about the topic. But if you're going to say that the League was reluctant to act during the Manchurian crisis, you need to be able to give some reasons why the League was reluctant to act. Not every reason, but some. So make a point now of trying to focus on the ones that stand out to you, the ones that you know best, the ones that you remember. And it was mentioned a moment ago that the League was not up for a big fight. Okay, that was the last thing the League wanted. And many people in the League felt that Japan actually had owned Manchuria and were entitled to take control of it. China wasn't even a proper country at this stage, in the sense that it had been divided into different regions and was being ruled over by different warlords. So many members of the League supported Japan in some way. Okay. Another one was mentioned, I think it's Alondra, that said Japan was a powerful member of the League. Okay. And people believed them when they said that they were attacked first. If they were attacked first, surely they have a right to defend themselves. Maybe they've overreacted a little bit, but they have a right to. And once again, many members of the League of Nations believed that to be the case. Scrolling down here, links back to this idea of not wanting the fight, and also the Great Depression, because the League couldn't really realistically afford to send soldiers over to stop the Japanese invasion, even if they wanted to. The League didn't have an army, but potentially they could have pulled bits of different armies from different member states and sent them over to protect Manchuria. They chose not to. Economic depression was a big issue there. This is a good one down here, and it's well worth remembering. Really is well worth remembering. You might end up writing about this. America refused to join the League, and Japan's main trading partner was America. So no matter what the League did, its main weapon was economic sanctions. Even if they hit Japan with the biggest economic sanctions they could, it wouldn't have had much of an impact, because Japan would have carried on trading with America. And all of this meant that the League was slow in acting. It starts to ruin their credibility. It's already started actually, to be fair, but it again encourages people to lose faith in the League's ability to do its job. So what did the League actually do? Let me go off this really briefly. Do you remember the man that was put in charge of the inquiry? His name was Lord something. Turn it over to the chat bar now. Lord Lytton, Lauren, absolutely well done. Lord Thomas, I'm not sure where you got that one from, Ethan. You put a question right there, like you weren't sure. No, maybe his name was Thomas, but I don't think it was. Lord Lytton, maybe his first name was Thomas Lytton, who knows? But no, it was actually Lord Lytton, and he wrote the Lytton report. Dom, do you remember how long it took him to publish that report? You've hedged your bets there, one or the other. It's 1 year, which is terrible, really. The League of Nations is being seen to act, so they send over this lord to do an investigation, and it takes him a full year before he publishes. Now, Alondra, you've written 2 years there. Now, I need to go and check. Now, it was, in fact, 1 year. Okay, after everything was already figured out by countries. Yeah, and when he finally published his report, which morally condemned Japan, gave them a good telling off, one of the punishments that the League could impose, it was so long in coming that countries had already come to that conclusion. His report did not tell people anything that they didn't already know. Japan was the aggressor and they had overreacted, even if they had been attacked in the first place. So, this report morally condemned Japan. It told them off on the world scene. Japan, you are in the wrong. You need to rethink your course of actions. And what did Japan end up doing? Which in many ways was a disaster for the League. Yeah, the League did nothing, Ethan, but what did Japan end up doing? We're telling Japan off. We're morally condemning Japan. You are wrong. You mustn't invade or you must retreat from Manchuria. They left the League. Which, once again, I think you could argue this was an event that made it difficult for the League to deal with aggression, especially in the future during the Abyssinian crisis, because the League is stronger with big, powerful countries as members. When Japan leaves, it automatically weakens the League of Nations. And on top of that, it humiliates them in a way where they are made to look like they cannot control their own members, which in many ways they can. Japan was a leading member of the League, along with Britain, Italy, France. They should be upholding the values of the League of Nations, not double-crossing it. And the League's inability to deal with one of its leading members just showed the League to be utterly weak and definitely made it difficult to deal with aggression in the future. Okay, so that is the Manchurian crisis, and now we're going to have a look at the Abyssinian crisis, which was very, very similar. Okay, so you should once again be able to see the online textbook, and scroll over here. Just like Manchuria being in China, you need to know that Abyssinia is modern-day Ethiopia, and it was an independent country in Africa. Have a look at the map briefly before we start. Oh, wrong way. Much of Africa had already been divided up by the European countries. They saw Africa as a cake that needed to be divided, and countries rushed in to ensure that they didn't miss out on their slice of the African cake. Now, Britain was one of the main protagonists here. They were awful in Africa. I think by 1930, we ruled over 1/3 of the entire African continent, which is shocking. But Britain was doing it, France was doing it, other European nations were doing it also. So it makes sense from an Italian point of view that they rush in and don't miss out on their slice of the African cake. And if you have a look at Abyssinia here, and we're going to mention this in a minute as a reason for the invasion, we see that there's an Italian colony just to the north, Italian territory there, Eritrea, and Somaliland was also controlled by Italy. It would have been very easy for Italy to invade Abyssinia because of their colonies around it. And to think that every other country was doing it, Britain was doing it, France was doing it. So how the hell could they get on their righteous high horse and condemn Italy for doing exactly the same? Well, they did. And that's one of the reasons why Italy stuck 2 fingers up to the League and left. How dare they condemn us when they're doing exactly the same? So, Abyssinia is in Africa, modern-day Ethiopia. Now, why did Mussolini want Italy? Now, he promised, he was a fascist dictator. It's not really that important. Fascism is where you're not allowed to believe in anything other than what the government want you to believe in. It's the government's way or the highway sort of thing. He was a dictator, a bit like Hitler, exactly like Hitler, in fact. And he was elected on a promise to rebuild the ancient Roman Empire. And that's not the whole of the Roman Empire, but just to build colonies, to make Italy strong again economically by invading other countries. Okay, so he'd been elected on a promise to do that. On top of that, starts down here, Britain and France had added much of Africa to their own empires throughout the 19th century, that's the 1800s. Mussolini felt that he should be able to do exactly the same, and Abyssinia is an ideal target because of the Italian colonies surrounding it. So it's a bit hypocritical of the League of Nations led by Britain and France to condemn Italy for doing exactly the same that they did. Okay. On top of that, and it links into what we've already mentioned, the Italian economy was suffering. Okay, it was suffering because of the Wall Street crash, and that simply were not the natural resources that Abyssinia possessed. In Abyssinia, they had access to huge areas of land that could be used for farming. There were natural resources there, gold even, coal, prospect of making steel, things that would be very, very good for the Italian economy. And the last reason, these are all reasons, but the last reason that I would focus on, again, links back to what we've already mentioned, that Italy was, or Mussolini was convinced that Britain and France wouldn't stop him. One, because Britain and France had already done this themselves, so it'd be a bit hypocritical, but also he knew that they needed him. Mussolini had signed a stressor front with Britain and France previously in 1935, where they agreed to stand up together to the threat of Hitler. Mussolini was going to use this as leverage. He knew Britain and France needed him to stand up to Hitler, so he was going to take advantage of the situation. He knew they couldn't complain too much because they needed him so very badly. So, those are some of the reasons why Mussolini decided to invade Abyssinia. Now, what you can see on the following page, which we're not really going to focus on at all, is how the invasion happened. You are not going to have to write about how the invasion went down. It's worth focusing on this pact that he made here. We're going to talk about this on the next page, okay? But Pierre Lavelle, the French foreign minister, met with Samuel Hoare, the British foreign minister, and they secretly agreed that Mussolini should be able to take huge parts of Abyssinia. And they did this so he was not to be upset, okay, to not upset him, because they needed him as part of this stressor front. So we'll come back to this in a moment. One thing that I do want to draw your attention to is that before Italy or the League of Nations imposed economic sanctions, the League morally condemned the invasion. Once again, it shows how weak moral condemnation actually can be. When Italy was invading, when they were in the process of invading Abyssinia, the League morally condemned Italy. Was that enough to stop Mussolini? 100% no. Who cares? Mussolini didn't care that the world was telling him off, or at least the League of Nations was telling him off, because his people were celebrating. They were treating him like a king, because he was doing all of this for the good of Italy. So unfortunately, this is another example of why the League struggled to deal with aggression, moral condemnation, and to a certain degree economic sanctions, and even mitigation. They're not really powerful deterrents. They're easily ignored. So the League did morally condemn Italy, but it achieved nothing. Italy ignored it and carried on the invasion. In fact, Haile Selassie, the Abyssinian emperor, spoke to the League personally, and he warned them how disastrous this would be, not just for Abyssinia, but for the future of the League of Nations. I think he saw what many of us can see now, that people were losing faith in the League. The League was meant to stop bigger countries from bullying smaller countries, yet the League failed to protect Manchuria, and now it was failing to protect Abyssinia. And Haile Selassie was very, very critical of the League's decisions, and quite rightly so. So yeah, again, you don't need much about the invasion. I wouldn't spend ages trying to memorize step by step what happened during the invasion of Abyssinia. Okay, and then this bit, and this is our last bit now. And just like with Manchuria, we're going to have a look at what the League actually did. Well, we've already mentioned that the League imposed moral condemnation upon Italy during the invasion. It did not work. Haile Selassie spoke to the League of Nations, and basically the world knew about this, and told them what a disaster it was going to be if they did not do something. So maybe the League listened to Haile Selassie to a certain degree and decided they needed to go to the next stage. They needed to up the ante in their sanctions towards Italy. So finally, the League did decide to impose economic or trade sanctions. This is the League's major weapon. The world, or at least countries, rely upon the world trade. Countries trade with each other. If a massive group of countries gangs up on you and say, hey, look, we're not going to trade with you anymore, then that could have serious implications. And it could have had serious implications for Italy. It could have forced Mussolini to rethink his invasion plans. However, when they did impose economic sanctions, they didn't hit the big industries. The trade sanctions did not include oil, steel, iron, or coal. Mussolini was able to carry on trading in these big industries, still making huge amounts of money. Okay? And as a result, the trade sanctions didn't really hit the Italian economy at all. Now, why didn't? Are you looking for, I think she left with bag on shoulder and everything else. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry, it's not important.
Well, yeah, it's always when you want them though, isn't it? They never quite get set. Take care, Claire. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, so not hitting Italy in these big industries allowed Italy to carry on trading and making huge amounts of money. So the economic sanctions imposed by the League of Nations really didn't have the desired effect. Now, why didn't Britain and France and other members go the whole hog and hit Italy with sanctions on these big industries? Dare I say, many members of the League probably wanted to, but for Britain and France, it would have been a disaster because we don't want to upset Italy. We don't want to upset Mussolini because they're relying upon Mussolini to stand up to the threat of Hitler later on. Okay. Also, it does mention there that the USA again, not being a member of the League, causing problems, says that the USA and the USSR could continue to supply Mussolini with these industries, continue to trade. Again, it shows how selfish Britain and France were. Okay, they were meant to be upholding the values and the commitments of the League of Nations, but they only do that when it suits them. And when it doesn't suit them, they kind of turn a blind eye to everything that's going on. And I think that is the case in Manchuria and, especially in Abyssinia. Another example that proves that point is the Suez Canal. If you have a look at the map, you can see the Suez Canal connecting the Mediterranean to, I think it's the Red Sea. I stand to be corrected. This is the Indian Ocean, but either way. It allowed Italy to sail through the Med, the Italian Navy, to sail through the Med, down through the Suez Canal and hit Abyssinia. It was a much shorter distance than going around the whole Horn of Africa. Mussolini later said that he might not have been able to carry on with his invasion if trade sanctions were put on coal and the Suez Canal was closed. He wasn't sure that he'd have enough coal fuel to sail his armies all the way around the Horn of Africa. Not effectively anyway, he could get them there, but could he get enough men, troops, supplies, and all of that stuff? So, yes, Britain and France not closing the Suez Canal kind of made the Italian invasion much easier than it could have been. Here's the Hoare-Lavelle Pact. And this one is somewhat worrying. Bearing in mind that Britain and France are the leading members of the League, this just shows how devious Britain and France could be in trying to protect their own interests. They did not want to get involved in a war against Mussolini. They wanted to keep Mussolini on side. It would be very easy for Britain and France just to turn a blind eye to it, but they can't really, okay? But in secret, Pierre Lavelle and Samuel Hoare, they met, okay? It was two foreign ministers, and they met, and they agreed that Italy should be given areas in Abyssinia, okay? And Abyssinia would be reduced to about half its size. They're trying to kind of reduce a war, okay? But in doing this, they're kind of stabbing the League of Nations and Abyssinia in the back. Okay? And it just, again, shows how Britain and France, at least the foreign ministers, were especially keen to preserve their own interests. Now, when this became public, all hell broke loose, okay? The press published it all across the front page, and it was clear that they were not upholding the values of the League of Nations. In fact, they were stabbing Abyssinia in the back, and both the politicians were forced to resign. It was very easy for Britain and France to say, hey, look, they don't represent our views. They were just doing it by themselves. They were mavericks doing things without consulting the country. But I secretly believe that, it's not so secretly if I'm telling you, but I truly believe that Britain and France probably would be supporting these individuals in what they did. It was very easy just to labour the blame all upon them and say, no, it's just them doing it. But actually, I'm sure Britain and France would have been supporting this because it meant that they could have avoided a war. They didn't have lots of money to fight a war against Italy, and they wanted to keep Italy on side as part of this stress up front. So lastly, on what the League did in Abyssinia, and I suppose this is definitely a failure of the League, because the League did impose economic sanctions upon Italy, but also Abyssinia. And what they did was they banned their members from selling weapons to Abyssinia or Italy. And I understand why. They're trying to approach this in a fair way and stop a potential conflict, because if members of the League are selling guns and weapons to these two countries, it could prolong the war. But not allowing Abyssinia to buy weapons from other countries involved in the League of Nations put them at the mercy of the Italians. And the Italians used planes and tanks and chemical weapons to absolutely devastate the Abyssinian army. So I would argue that this is another failure of the League, not to recognise the situation. And in fact, protecting Abyssinia is not hitting them with trade sanctions on weapons. That simply does not make sense. So, ladies and gents, I think that brings us to the end. Oh, it's worth just one second. It's worth just highlighting this paragraph here, the end of the League of Nations. Because after Manchuria did not spell the end for the League of Nations, but it definitely did push the League towards the point of collapse. People, countries were losing faith in the League's ability to do its job. Okay, and as a result of the economic sanctions and everything else, Italy chose to leave the League in 1936. Okay, and it says there this left Britain, France, and USSR, who joined in 1934, to run the League. But Britain and France had already shown their lack of interest in upholding the League of Nations if it doesn't fit with what they want, with their intentions. And we see that later on with the USSR, that loses faith in Britain and France's ability to protect them. We're going to look at Hitler's foreign policy next, and part of Hitler's foreign policy was Lebensraum, but also the destruction of communism. Well, the USSR is a communist nation, so it makes sense that they would now join forces with Britain and Britain and France. But throughout the 1930s, Britain and France just totally disrespect the USSR and Stalin. And as a result, when it comes to the outbreak of war by 1939, the USSR has signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler and Germany. Even though Germany wants to destroy communism, they simply believe that Britain and France will be powerless to protect them from Hitler. So they join forces with Hitler. So the failure of the League of Nations I would argue, is a devastating event which contributed totally towards World War II. Right, thank you very much. There's only a few of you here. What is it? There's 4 of you, 5 of you? Yeah, only 5. Which is a shame, really, isn't it? I hope that more people would join in, especially because you want to convince me that you're working hard to get a decent grade, because I decide upon your grade. Now, let's say you have a bad mock exam, but you come to every single revision session. Well, that fills me with more confidence that you just had a blip on your mock, and in fact, you would do really well if you were to sit a real exam. So it is important that you do show up and you do attend. Once again, it makes me feel confident that if you were to sit a real exam, you would do really well. Just look on the chat bar. Before we finish, what would be the Indian way of life be made up of? What? You started maths on my day? That takes the absolute... You know what I'm going to say, but I'm not going to say it because it's being recorded. Anyway, yeah, maybe I'll do it on a different day so we don't clash with maths. That could be something worth discussing during our lessons. Anyway, Don, it says, before we finish, what would the Indian way of life be made up of? I'm not sure what you mean. When you say Indian, we're not talking about the Indians, are we? We're talking about Manchurians, who are basically Chinese to a certain degree. We're talking about Abyssinians, who are Ethiopians, and Italians. The Indian way of life. Topic for revision. Did I write that and show my homework or something? If I'm talking about the Indian way of life, I'm talking about the American West. Yeah, I'm talking about the American West. I'm talking about the lives of the Plains Indians. Now, there will be a question on your mock exam about the Plains Indians. I gave lots of tips and clues and pointers towards this during the revision session that we did over the holidays, which many of you attended. So I'd definitely be revisiting that and thinking about what parts of the Indian way of life do I need to know about? Do I need to know how their way of life was destroyed, or do I need to know why they were successful at living on the plains? Stuff like that. Would you say Fort Laramie? What, Fort Laramie is going to be on the exam? You could probably mention the treaty at Fort Laramie, how it was kind of the first mention of a reservation systems. The 1968 treaty at Fort Laramie after Red Cloud's War saw the creation of the Great Sioux Reservation, and that was at the center of the disagreements that caused the Battle of Little Bighorn. So yeah, Dom, I would have a look over that, definitely. We're going to have a look at that in class next time. We finished the medicine topic now, so we're going to go back over the American West. Do you know when our mocks actually are? Has a date? Right, I think they put a date out a while ago, Lauren, but I wouldn't necessarily believe it. I know they're going to try and put it back as far as possible to give you the maximum chance to revise and potentially do well. If we hold your mock as soon as you get back, that seems a bit silly because we don't need to submit your grades for a long time yet. So we might as well give you as long as possible before we need to submit those grades. So I'm sorry, no, I can't give you a definitive answer on when the mocks are. They may have been decided, but I don't know if they have. I will ask. I'll see if I can find out for you. And Dom, you've said there that you've done stuff on Custer. I'd definitely be doing stuff on Custer in the Battle of Little Bighorn as well. Okay, I'm going to leave it there, ladies and gents, and I'm going to catch up with you in our next lessons. And like I said, pretty much for everybody now, I think we're moving on to the American West revision, and we'll have a look at the American West exam paper and do some exam practice. Okay, so take care all. I will see you soon. Take care, Alondra. See you, Dom, Lauren. Take it easy, everybody. See you, Ethan. Been a pleasure. See you all.